Robert Anton Wilson, who coined the term Chapel Perilous. This is when something happens in your life and it all begins to fit together and make sense. Too much sense. Because it's coming from the exterior and it seems to either mean that you're losing your mind or you are somehow the central focus of a universal conspiracy that is leading you towards some unimaginable breakthrough.
Hello, and welcome to Hilaritas Podcast, brought to you by Hilaritas Press. I am your host, Mike Gathers. Join us as we explore the world of iconic writer Robert Anton Wilson, those who influenced him, and those who have been influenced by him. Visit us at hilaritaspress.com/podcast for show notes, links, and past episodes. In our last episode, we concluded our 8-part Cosmic Trigger series on the major influences of Robert Anton Wilson. With this episode, we change gears and chat with underground filmmaker, paratheater ritualist, professional astrologer, teacher, writer, forest walker, dreamer, and no-form engineer, Antero Alli, on Chapel Perilous, paratheater technology, and the 8-circuit model. The original idea behind this interview was to produce a multi-guest mega episode on Chapel Perilous as part of our Cosmic Trigger series. But in the end, it made more sense to release those interviews on their own as separate episodes. Towards the end of this interview, Antero asked me about my work on the 8-circuit model. I'll save the details for the interview, but since he and I spoke, I've slowly started a YouTube playlist on my current take of the 8-circuit model from a relational framework. You can find a link to that playlist in the show notes. The first 2 episodes serve more as warm-ups for me while I start dipping into things with a high-level overview for episode 3. And with all that said, I'm excited to introduce our guest for the episode, no-formologist, Antero Alli. Antero Alli, welcome to the Hilaritas Podcast.
Thanks. It's good to be here.
First things first, did I pronounce your name correctly?
Well, the last name is actually pronounced Ali. When you pronounce it Ali, it's the Arabic pronunciation. Last name is A-L-L-I. Ali would be just one L, Ali. So it's Ali.
Ollie.
Kind of like Stan and Ollie.
Yeah, I think of volley, Ollie.
Yeah.
Okay. And Antero.
Antero is exactly right.
Excellent.
And you are Mike
My
Gathers.
name is Mike Gathers.
Okay.
So, Antero, I know you as someone who has expressed a commitment to living without a self-image, and I find myself hesitant to introduce you. I'm willing to take a crack at it, but I'm wondering, could you introduce yourself?
Oh, gosh. Well, this thing about living without a self-image, that's just a kind of a subjective experience of mine of not being able to, let's say, cling to any set idea of who I am. In fact, I very rarely think about myself. I'm I guess, more busy just kind of living my life to think too much about myself. For those who have not read my books or seen my films or heard about me, the 99% of the population out there, my name is Antero, and I was born in Helsinki, Finland, about 69 years ago. And I have somehow managed to survive by hook and crook all these years without a day job. I've been drifting in a parallel dimension outside of the 9-to-5 punch clock timeline that many other people are locked into for reasons of their own. And I have, let's say, really early on, probably in my early 20s, decided that time was the currency, the true currency of my life, and that the time of my life was more important than money. And I just had to make enough money to get by so I could have all the time I need to do the things that I'm here to do, which is basically what has happened. And here I am.
Excellent. Well, I'm glad you're here with us. We wanted to talk today about Chapel Perilous. So maybe to cut right to the chase, how might you define Chapel Perilous?
Okay. So I'm waiting for the spooky music at this time, if there's any kind of cue for music. So Chapel Perilous, how to define it? The way I first heard about it was through reading Bob Wilson's Cosmic Trigger. And having also had the privilege of meeting Bob and hanging out with Bob in the late 70s and early 80s back in Berkeley, California, I had the chance to ask him where he discovered the term Chapel Perilous, because it was really intriguing the way he had written about it in his book. And he said, from what he's gathered, it's a term that he discovered in studying some of the old English tales around King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. That the story there was that King Arthur put to task anybody that wanted to serve his kingdom and become one of the Knights of the Round Table had to spend a night in Chapel Perilous. And Chapel Perilous was supposedly a place where the knight would be exposed to his greatest fears. And King Arthur basically would say, well, if you can come out of the chapel with your sanity and your heart intact, you can sit at my table. And so Chapel Perilous, I guess from there, I think Bob, and I think I would agree with this too, my own kind of way of seeing it, it represents an episode in one's life, and it could be a series of episodes in one's life where one is in some ways forced to face one's deepest fears and to somehow live through those fears and come out on the other side without completely losing your mind, and to come out, in a sense, wiser for it. And so my own experience of Chapel Perilous happened, there's been several visits into the chapel over the years, but initially, early on, way back in my 20s, I fell through the trap door during what I would call a nonstop catastrophic romance with a much younger woman at the time. I thought I was losing my mind in terms of all the projections, of the psychic projections of the anima and so forth. And I was grateful to have also been meeting with Bob at that time and looking to his metaphor of the Chapel Perilous as a way to live through my experience. And the way I do it, the way I have done it in my life, I'm kind of a hardcore artist type. And what that means is that I tend to work through my traumas through my art. And for me, art at that time meant creating theater. So I basically at that time wrote a 2-act play called Chapel Perilous. And I played, I performed in the play itself, and I was able to, through that process, use the play as a kind of ritual for exorcising myself out of the chapel at that time. And I was able to move on from the experience and continue on with my life, beyond the catastrophic romance. I was able to move on. So I think I'm going to stop right there for now. I could just go on and on.
I'm curious, was that the first point where you used theater as sort of a personal or spiritual tool for evolution and development?
Well, I don't know if I've ever used theater or any art as a tool for personal development or evolution, because I don't know if those things actually exist.
Fair enough.
What I've used them mostly for is to help me integrate and process and kind of learn to stomach some of the more difficult experiences that have been thrown my way, and to basically transform them into something beautiful, something creative or productive, and then share that with the world. And this is part of, I think, the artist temperament and anybody that does this kind of thing. And that started early on with me, in my teenage years before I was doing theater. I had some pretty dark points, as a lot of teenagers do. And I worked through those by hand drawing a series of cartoon panels inspired by the great Robert Crumb Zap comic books.
Excellent. So would it be proper to say you've used art as a way to work through experience?
Yes, especially experience of a traumatic nature, experiences that have come to me as a shock, where my idea of myself, my world was shattered and broken into pieces. And it's like I've got all these pieces of myself. And then how do I rearrange these pieces through a process almost like self-reinvention? And so my artistic trajectory has pretty much been a series of self-reinventions over the years.
I gotcha. Would you use the word integration?
Oh, yeah. Integration is kind of a big deal. What I mean by to integrate something is very simple, but not easy. And which is to say, to integrate something means to actually experience something. If I can genuinely experience something and pass through the heart of the experience, it will tend to become integrated.
Ah, the only way out is through.
That's how I've experienced it.
Yes. All right. Well, just to reset a little, what I heard is Chapel Perilous is a place where we face one's deepest fears. And I'm wondering, it seems to me like we're on the brink of some sort of global Chapel Perilous. Does that resonate with you?
I'd say we're well past the brink.
Ah.
We're, slam dunked in it.
Swimming
and drowning, gasping and groaning, moaning. I mean, it all depends on how each of us manages to navigate the escalating uncertainty of the times. Many people don't know how to manage their anxiety during this time. And so there's the pharmaceutical industry is getting a lot of money right now for a number of different reasons. I don't want to go into right now, but learning to manage your anxiety during this time, I think, is a really great idea.
Well, you have a new book out, State of Emergence, Experiments in Group Ritual Dynamics. If I understand it correctly, this is paratheater techniques that you feel can help us through this.
Helps some of us. I say that because it's the book is a distillation of about 40 years of experience in a somatic discipline. It's a discipline that combines methods from physical theater, dance, some yoga, and zazen meditation, but standing zazen, not sitting zazen. And it's a very physically vigorous and emotionally demanding discipline, which is why I say it's not for everybody. It's for those individuals that can muster up the commitment to basically do this work. And this is something that's been, if I'm going to say, okay, what's my life's work? So this would be a book that encapsulates my life's work.
Nice. Wow, I'm just taking that in. That's a big statement there. And as I understand it, you've retired from paratheater. I was surprised to hear that.
Well, I don't know if retired is the right word, because I've been subjecting myself to this work, meaning I've actually done this work for 40 years. And so there's no retiring from it. It lives on in me every day, every moment. I have stopped facilitating this work for groups.
Gotcha. It seems to me this paratheater work, it has what my motif of, I think of as the hero's journey, which is maybe ties back to this Knights of the Round Table story about deliberately entering Chapel Perilous, navigating those waters and coming through on the other side richer for it, and then sharing those gifts with the community.
Well, I think pretty much so. I mean, I haven't worked a 9-to-5 job, places me in an experience of time itself and an experience of continuity of consciousness that has pretty much catapulted me out to the fringes of society as we know it. And so, and from those fringes, from those outer kind of limits, I've developed a certain perspective. I can see things. And yet it's not enough for me to see things or to have a perspective, at least for me, if I'm not able to bring that vision back somehow and share it with people. So I'm not just, some kind of, freakish monk, trapped in a cave, focusing on the crystals or whatever. So this is part of why I write books, part of why I make films. These are ways in which I reach individuals, reach people. And this is a pretty important part of my journey because as an individual, I'm not really social. I'm not antisocial. I'm asocial. That would be an apt label for me. And I say that because I don't really hang out. I don't go to pubs. I don't go to parties. I don't hang out with people. My primary experience with other people has always been in conjunction with artistic projects, working and rehearsing and producing plays, theater, film, teaching various topics based in my books and so forth. So it's been a kind of singular life in that way, but it's not been what you might call a social life, or I've sacrificed my social life for these other kinds of experiences.
And it sounds like sharing your art helps you stay connected to the community.
Absolutely. Yeah, it helps me stay connected to the local community where I screen my films, but also the non-local community, through my books and through YouTube and Vimeo, where all my films are actually now available for free viewing.
Yes, we'll include a link to those in the show notes for sure. You mentioned asocial. And I know there's an asocial contract that seems like a big part, like a foundational to the paratheater work.
It is. We've simply found that the work becomes more effective in an asocial climate. And what that means is that, the usual reasons for a group to meet, which is to say, social reasons like meeting the need for community, meeting the need for support, meeting the need for courtship, for approval, for love, affection from other people. So these are all important social needs. But in this particular work, those needs actually get in the way of the primary objective of the work, which is basically gaining a more profound access to the internal landscape of the soul. And through that, source point, finding connection with archetypal patterns and discovering actually new ways of interacting with others that bypass social conventions or social expectations. And the asocial climate is actually, it can be created, it can be kind of set up. And it's set up in several ways. One of them is that everyone in the group simply agrees to become responsible for their own safety, so that in the face of any kind of weirdness or perceived threat or some big energies, so that they become accountable or do their best to make themselves safe in the room, so they're not calling mom or dad over to them. They're not calling me as the facilitator over to them to make them safe. So when everyone becomes accountable for their own safety, already we're starting to, a kind of a grown-up group is starting to form of adults, not just children seeking parental guidance and support and love and so forth. And then there's a certain relationship with the space itself as a value. And what that means is that there's a certain method we call space forming, where we find a way to move in the room as a group without relating to anybody else, but relating to the space itself as a value, space itself as intelligence, space itself as sacred. And so the space then becomes alive with a certain presence that we imbue it with as we move through that space. The other thing too is that to sustain that sense of the asocial, people who are involved in this kind of group dynamic, they do best by meeting their social needs outside of the group, so they don't look to the group to meet those social needs. So it's socially austere is what it is. And anybody that approaches the group process to meet their social needs will simply tend to become frustrated. It just simply wouldn't work.
Is there, and I think you said this, it's more of an adult relationship than a needs-based relationship. My question would have been, is there room for relationships within an asocial contract?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. But it's somewhat difficult to describe because let's say you've got a room full of individuals, let's say a room full of like 9 or 10 individuals, and they've all agreed to begin accessing a particular source, like an archetype, let's say the power of the feminine, let's say. And since each of the 9 or 10 individuals were all raised in different parts of the country, different ancestries, different traumas, different histories, basically, the experience of the feminine and the expression of the feminine is all going to come out differently for each individual. But we're all sourcing the feminine. So there's a sense of group unity. We're all sourcing the same archetype, but it's all coming out differently, idiosyncratically with each individual. And then there's a point where interaction it results, how can I put this here? Because there's certain things that have to occur before asocial interaction actually happens. And one of them is that the internal commitment to the source that you're serving, in this case, like the power of the feminine, has to reach a very high level within each individual in the group. And when it reaches that high level, then in a sense, each individual is surrendered to and is being subject to the power of the feminine, which is, in a sense, shaping and moving and animating their expression, their gesture, their way of moving across the floor, meaning that they're now, in a sense, activated by the feminine as it's moving through them. And each individual, as I said, is showing a different expression of this. So as the commitment, the self-commitment to the feminine increases, there is a kind of blossoming of presence that naturally reaches out to others, where the interaction at that point becomes a process of mutual offering of presence. And this is what makes it very different from any social or theatrical, for that matter, level of interaction. Social and theatrical interaction between individuals usually depends on people wanting things from each other. Objectives are fulfilled. On the stage, even different characters are brought to life in any stage play by wanting something from the other characters. A series of objectives. What do I want from this person? What do I want from this person? In the asocial climate, in the process of asocial interplay, nobody wants anything from anybody else. It's completely liberated from that social convention through the spirit of mutual offering. And these offerings act on each other, meaning that, there's someone coming at me offering their presence, and that acts on me, that it influences me. And so I have a response to being influenced by your emanation or by your offering. And so there's this interaction of people acting on each other, but not wanting anything from each other. And it's spontaneous. And that's also a big difference between asocial and social interaction. Oftentimes, social interactions are very steeped in habit. Very rarely are they actually spontaneous. And so we're experimenting with spontaneous interaction here.
So that brings up the idea of just being tuned in to the present moment.
Yes, but specifically is how to sustain your commitment to the source you're serving,
right,
while interacting across the board. So there's a kind of double vision occurring, a double vision between the commitment to your, what I'll call your verticality, meaning the source that is within you. Maybe it's above you or within or below you, but it's more vertical in nature. And then the horizontal dimension involves other people and how to interact with others from a higher level of vertical integrity so that you don't lose touch with the source you're serving while interacting with others. And that's also rare in social interactions. You don't really get that so much.
Right. So the asocial interaction there in a nutshell of interacting without need. You've said it. I don't know that I could summarize it well enough.
It's based in not wanting things from each other, but rather from a point of mutual offering.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really an offering of the self. In fact, one of the aims of paratheater is basically to learn and to come into some kind of direct experience of the total offering of the self. And of course, to even be in the place of participating and committing to a total offering of the self, you have to have a really strong sense of self to start with. That part is empowered. The sense of self is empowered through the particular archetype or the source that you might be working with at the time. And in the paratheater process, we work with multiple sources, many different sources. I just pick, the source of the feminine out of the hat just then. There's the masculine, and there's the four elements. There's the trinity of the destroyer, creator, nourisher. Typically, we don't, the sources we draw upon are not from the social personality. They're from more universal or more archetypal dimensions.
Right, but there seems to be a notion that you have to find yourself before you can lose yourself. Is that?
Yeah, not really. I mean, that's a kind of a easy, more kind of flippant way of talking about it. It's because, how can I put this? Part of what makes it even possible to begin accessing these impersonal forces of the feminine or the masculine or the four elements is a precursor process, something that has to come before that. And that is a rather profound receptivity that we achieve through a method we call no form. It's a standing zazen meditation. And this is also another reason why this work is not for everybody. Not everybody is up for the challenge or even the capacity to relax the thinking machine and enter into an intimacy with void, to come into a profound state of internal receptivity where nothing is happening and it's not a problem.
And from this place of receptivity, you can begin sourcing these energies.
That's right. Yeah, exactly right. And then, what happens is that after we source them, sourcing the energies from this kind of deep internal receptivity, we kind of get shot up with the energy. We become very inflated, so to speak. We become very full of the energy. It's a very high octane energy state. And this is why after each engagement with these energies, we return to the no form stance, to the zazen standing position, to discharge, to return to being nothing, to release our attachment to the identification that we had with the big energy, to let it go, to let go of our attachment to whatever was happening. And that becomes part of the ongoing discipline. So we use the no form to induce the trance that engages, that comes from engaging, these big energies. But then we return to no form to break the trance of those energies. So we return basically to being nobody but ourselves.
And use no form to initiate trance. You use the word receptivity. When you're discharging the energies, do you still approach it as receptivity, or is there a different approach?
Well, honestly, the approach is going to differ for each individual. The more charged an archetype is, meaning some archetypes have a greater emotional charge for each of us. Some are more charged than others. But anyway, the greater the charge of an archetype, the deeper the receptivity is necessary to discharge. And this is why, again, it's really a discipline. It's a kind of work process where if you're not motivated to continue returning to void space, continue returning to this intimacy with void, even, to the point of discovering how this what we call void, or the fertile void, or the state of potential, discovering how that actually might be the ground of our being. And so it is, in a sense, returning to the ground of our being after every ritual, so that, we're not leaving the room shot up with ourselves, thinking we're some god form or goddess or whatever.
Right. Might be dangerous for dinner.
Yeah. It's, I mean, it wouldn't. Yeah. It's basically a device to curb and minimize ego inflation, which can occur during this process. Any kind of transformative ritual process runs its own kind of dangers. And a lot of people involved in the occult rituals and ritual ceremonial magic and so forth have come across this. It's very common. There's a lot of ceremonial magicians also just happen to be dicks.
Yeah.
Because they haven't figured out that, all that big energy work is an ego inflation event. And if they don't have, a counterbalance to, restore humility, they go around thinking that they're something that they're not.
Right. So we discharge the energy through no form. Does that end the ritual?
That ends that ritual that we were
ritual.
in. Yeah, because each paratheater session runs about 3 hours, and in that 3 hours there can be anywhere from 3 to 5, maybe 6 rituals, so that there's a series of events that occur that require constant return to no form over and over again. It becomes its own kind of meditation practice that's dynamic meditation. We're not sitting down meditating.
But a way to return to center, maybe?
A return to being nothing. And
there you go.
Yeah, for some that's going to be experienced returning to center. For others that may be a return to return to the experience of I don't know who the fuck I am.
Fair enough. And from there, is there a final closing ritual for a given 3-hour session?
It's usually a cool down ritual. It's usually a ritual that is specifically designed to start cooling the jets, because part of the effect of this work is to activate the central nervous system, which in a sense triggers an internal subjective experience of the energy body, of becoming, in a sense, temporarily identified as a being of light. The light body, the energetic body becomes lit up. And so the central nervous system, both specifically the sympathetic nervous system, becomes hyperstimulated. And so the no form process is very helpful and useful for kind of cooling off the jets and dissipating the charge. And some people are not able to do that. They haven't, gotten deep enough into their no form practice, so they leave the session still completely lit up and they can't sleep. They're up 3 or 4 in the morning. And for those individuals, I recommend soaking in an Epsom salt bath, a cup, 1 cup per 100 pounds of body weight, and just soaking for about 15 minutes max, taking a shower, and then going to rest in a dark room. And that's been known. The salts have been known to neutralize excess electromagnetism in the body.
Gotcha. And from there, it seems like this is powerful work, and there needs to be, is there integration afterwards? Is there any sort of structure to that? How do you make sense of what happened?
Oh man, well that's a huge question. It's one of the more challenging parts of the work is how do I apply it to my daily life, and how does it fit into the life I'm living? So I'm just not going to ritual as a kind of Baptist church on Sunday event, and then I forget everything the next day. So I can only speak for myself. I've been very keen on integrating several components of the work over the years, only because I really haven't had any other choice. I mean, I've been doing this for 40 years, and so it's in my blood, it's in my bones, it's in my cells. And so, the whole notion of my verticality, I can conjure up in a split second. I can drop into no form just in a matter of moments. I can, so it's not like I have to try, but it's always there. And that's simply a virtue of me having done the work for so long. For other individuals who've only done it a year or 2 or even 5 years, it is more challenging how to find, ways. And, I tell them, look, if you're standing in line somewhere, it's a really great time just to drop into no form, just to stand there. Nobody's going to know that you're experiencing intimacy with void, and when you're standing in line at the grocery store, and then you can move on from there.
So no form is a tool for continually working with this experience, would you say? Or?
Well, it's in a sense, it's almost like, how can I put this? One of the long-term effects of my own life of having been subject to the no form experience over and over again, it has cultivated in me a kind of cultural immunity. And I mean immunity to the toxic culture at large, not all culture. And so it has become very valuable to me to live my life amidst what I would perceive as a deeply toxic culture at large. I won't even go into the nature of that because I think it's evident to a lot of people if you just pay attention that there's a lot of poison out there. It doesn't affect me. It kind of rolls off my back. I don't have that. I just don't care about it. I don't have the empathy for that. I'm not identified with that. And part of that, I think, has to do with just a certain comfort in not having to identify with anything. Sort of like what you mentioned at the beginning of this interview of living without a self-image. It's sort of like that.
So by cultivating that, you're able to navigate the toxicity of the world without it really getting its hooks in you.
Yeah, that's the way it's felt so far. And I only know that because, I watch the news like anybody else. And sometimes I watch the news with my wife and I see that she's like freaking out about all the things the news are spewing forth. And I'm not freaking out. I'm going, what's happening? And I would, we'd have a discussion about it. And then, because she's done paratheater too, but not as long as I am, but I remind her, well, if you can find some place within you that's, somehow relevant to your own internal legitimacy, to your own verticality, perhaps you can, watch the news with a little more perspective and not have to think that it's all the truth. There's all kinds of agendas that, mainstream media is attached to, that there's biases and so forth.
Yes, absolutely. So if we were able to summarize this paratheatrical experience, I'm looking at my notes here and I'm seeing words like learning spiritual authority through direct experience or soul making through feeling the body deeply. Does that begin to capture? I'm hearing a lot about no form and how that's a big part of this and a tool to just...
No, I think you're on it. I mean, those are pretty good, actually. One of the more difficult things that I've had to learn to do is talk about this work, because the very nature of the work is nonverbal. It's a nonverbal somatic discipline. Sometimes words will come into play, but for the most part, it remains nonverbal. And so there's these profound, in-depth intuitive experiences of profound emotion, sensation, psychic impressions. Mythopoetic sensibilities are aroused. There's rituals involving, let's say, extracting movements that are recalled from our dreams and putting those movements together in a choreography that we actually execute as a ritual choreography. The results of almost all of these rituals can be a bit shocking, can be a bit stunning to the intellectual thinking machine. And this is also why, again, this work is not for everybody, because everyone is responsible for their own peace of mind, their own sanity. And so you have to really find your own language and your own symbology and your own way of talking, thinking, and writing about this work if that's what you're going to do. Otherwise, you're left speechless.
In the sense that it's not for everybody, it seems like, if anything, we might be able to extract no form as a tool that's more accessible to the folks at large.
Well, it's funny that you say no form being the most accessible. I would say that would be the most inaccessible. To come into an authentic intimacy with void space, I think is a rare capacity. I think it can be learned. Some individuals have a certain knack or talent. They just have a certain innate ability there, and they don't even know they have it until it's labeled and named as such. But I think for the general populace, it's almost out of reach, is my guess. If there is anything that maybe might be most accessible, is the notion of meeting the body's central need of being felt deeply. And you can do this through exercise, you can do this through great sex, you can do this through just simply walking a lot, but some point where you're sweating is really the only time when your body's being felt deeply, is when there's sweat produced. Otherwise, it's not I don't think it really goes all the ways. You have to reach the sweat point. I mean, you know what I'm talking about because
I felt
done,
it.
yeah, you felt it. You've done long distance bike riding, right?
Yeah.
So you know what that's about. You know where it brings you. You feel your body deeply enough, and it releases visions. It releases states of consciousness that were simply not accessible before the ride.
Yes. And I felt being above tree line at high altitudes, just
Oh yeah,
that combination is sometimes it can be dangerous.
yeah, dizzying.
Yeah. Mm. And
So
just right all through breaking a sweat, feeling the body deeply.
See, that would be the first part. And if there's another part in the book, State of Emergence, it's on Amazon. You can get it to the publisher at Falcon Press. Would be an experiment with two different types of attention, of paying attention. What I refer to in the book as first and second attentions. And briefly, first attention refers to that awareness linked to the thinking machine. It's that awareness where we're automatically labeling things that we perceive. We see something, we label it a table or a chair or a door, we label it. And then there's also the same thinking machine that assigns meaning to things. Oh, this means that, this means that. So these are properties of the first attention. It's pretty much the predominant attention of the culture at large, the first attention. It's not the only attention, though. There's something also called the second attention. And the second attention would be that awareness linked to presence, energy, phenomena, without labels, without assigning labels or meaning. So how do it really represents the kind of interaction of seeing without thinking. So the thinking machine, the perceiving apparatus. So thinking is not the same as perception. And so these are two different ways of paying attention. One where you're assigning labels and meaning to everything, and one where you're relaxing that and simply seeing and being with the mystery of what you're witnessing.
Would you call that direct experience?
That comes very close to direct experience, yeah. And of course, both attentions are important and significant for our survival. But if you don't have an escape from first attention, if you can't somehow get away from that, it can lead to all kinds of psychological problems like claustrophobia, anxiety, violence, where you feel like you're trapped in your body and you can't. So there's all kinds of complications that come from that if you can't find escape. This is a lot of reasons why people get drunk. Or they take drugs. Is like it gives a temporary escape from the first attention.
Would you say the second attention is the gateway to no form?
It can be. I don't know if it is the gateway. It can be a gateway for some, but you see, the second attention is a function of attention. And no form, to me, is an expression of being.
So to the extent that you're still paying an attention, that's a form.
It's also, you're working with observer observed. And no form expresses a non-dualistic experience.
Gotcha. That helps me understand the depth of what we mean by no form, what you mean by no form.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's deep shit.
You introduced some concepts in your book that I think could be useful to folks that may not want to dig into paratheater, but still could get a lot out of your book. One is something about the poor baby. The victim complex is what I interpret that to mean. And it seems like shadow work. Is that power loss through the poor baby projection? Yeah,
that's a good way of describing it. Poor baby is a term to refer to one of many ways in which people participate in power loss in their lives and, diminish their own sense of place in the universe, and where they become more easily controlled and victimized by external agencies, whether that be the media or government or teachers or whatever.
And how do we escape that?
I don't know about we. That's
Fair enough.
This kind of the universal we has been thrown around a lot these days. I think, it's an individual process. And I say that because each nervous system is going to process the experience of power loss slightly differently. And, I think if you can stop the pity party, if you can get your attention off yourself, you can practice getting your attention off of yourself, basically, and put it on something else. It can be something as simple as making yourself useful, washing the dishes, doing the laundry, or maybe, helping somebody else that has a problem bigger than yours, or any way in which you can get your attention off yourself is going to help break down the poor baby.
Gotcha. Something about self-acceptance, is that?
Yeah, but sometimes the thing is that if you're deep in poor baby, the whole notion of self-acceptance, I think, is a little bit too much.
Foreign concept.
Too much to expect from you.
Right.
You're setting the bar a little high there. I think it's easier or simpler. I don't know about easier. It's simpler to just think, well, how do I get my attention off myself? How do I make myself useful, for example?
Gotcha.
And, I made a mess. I'll clean up my mess. That could be enough just to alleviate the self-pity for a moment. Clean up your mess.
Clean up your mess. And another power loss you mentioned or discussed is the courtship compulsion. Is that caused by poor relations with the anima or animus?
It can be. Yeah, that's a very complex power loss. And this, again, is going to really differ for each individual and their upbringing, the mother and father that raised them. The mother oftentimes is going to be the modeling of the internal anima for the man, and the father, the internal animus for the woman. And, not all anima and animus archetypes or modelings are positive. Some of them are like, individuals may have been raised by a cruel father figure or a absent mother or a smothering mother figure. So there's all kinds of variations to this. And this is a very common power loss, I think, for young people, teenagers, and also individuals in their 20s still, for like about 20 years there, where individuals are convinced that there's some kind of soulmate out there, the one that's going to change their lives, the dream lover, the one and only, and so forth. And so they're on the constant lookout, for who that might be. And then when there's someone that sort of looks or appears like that, then that unleashes the obsession and the unleashing of the psychic energies in one's own psyche onto that person. And it pretty much initiates eventually a kind of romantic catastrophe, because there's very little to no relating that can actually happen when you have this kind of massive psychic projection occurring. And so it doesn't really take long for things to go south or to go wrong.
And how do we I'm going to avoid the we. How might someone in this predicament find their way out?
Well, again, it differs for each individual. How do you find your way out of a nonstop catastrophic romance? Yeah, it depends, if they've gone poor baby on it. Sometimes there's a lot of self-pity that can come along with the experience of losing your soul in the projection and the anima or animus. It can feel like an experience of soul loss, like you've lost your soul. Well, you've projected it onto that other person, and they've, in a sense, embodied that. And so there can be a feeling of extreme alienation, rejection, annihilation. A whole kind of onslaught of negative emotions can come around, and it can even provoke violence. A lot of the violence and like domestic violence, I think, is caught up in unprocessed anima and animus projections, where there's no relating anymore. I mean, the word animosity comes from anima and animus. And animosity is a form of hatred and contempt.
No, I would agree. If you look at those things through the Jungian animus lens, I think you're onto something.
Yeah. So, how do you get out of that? I think probably the most direct way, and this might apply to this word we, is to suffer through it,
Mm.
is to just go through the center of it, go through the heartbreak, because that's what it's about. It's about unmet expectations. It's about disappointment. It's about people not living up to your big ideals for them. And that's a very important heartbreak to experience. And so I would say just go right through the heartbreak. And if you're an artist, sing your sad song, create your heartbreaking poetry, break the hearts of other people through your art.
Powerful words, going right into the depths of the pain.
Yeah, and through the other side if you can. I mean, that takes a lot of courage, takes a lot of heart actually to pass through the heart of any human condition and go right through the other side. Outcome unpredictable, outcome unknown.
Right. It ties in with our whole thing about Chapel Perilous and facing your deepest fears and going through.
One of the things I wanted to mention about Chapel Perilous, once a year, I run an 8-week online interactive course for individuals who are studying Timothy Leary's 8-circuit brain system, which I'm very adverse in. I might even say I'm an expert at it.
That's
and in the course, there's a whole section where we enter into Chapel Perilous experience, how to recognize it, how to identify it, finding ways to go into it, how to escape it. So it becomes its own kind of practice, the entering and escaping of Chapel Perilous. There's a number of ways to go about that. And so we cover that in the course. And I mention this because the course is actually, the next session is coming up in March. And in fact, the enrollment just recently opened up, just like I think yesterday or the day before. And it fills up pretty quickly. If any of this sounds interesting to your listeners, verticalpool.com is the website that has all the work that I do.
We've been talking about paratheater in regards to Chapel Perilous. How might you summarize the 8-circuit model on Chapel Perilous?
That's good. My ideas have gone through some changes since I first did that in my first book, Angel Tech, which I wrote in 1985. And I wrote it back then. I saw Chapel Perilous as an interval between the 4th and the 5th circuits. And that worked for me for a while until I got older, until I had more experience. And then I had to recalibrate and rethink the whole relationship of Chapel Perilous to the 8 circuits, which I did in my 2009 book called The 8-Circuit Brain. So now I look at Chapel Perilous as a kind of non-local strata of experience that hovers over all 8 circuits or somehow around all 8 circuits. It's a place where the unintegrated parts of our personality reside. Meaning it's very rare that you find an individual who's fully realized, who's fully integrated all of their complexes, or they've transformed and healed their traumas. It's very rare that you find such an individual. Most of us are almost completely unintegrated. I mean, it's really an extreme situation that we find ourselves in the current, digital era, with internet addiction and so forth. And we become digitized versions of ourselves. And we just lose track of the faculty of imagination because we're absorbing so many images from other people. We're finding a difficult time in creating images we can call our own and so forth and so on. And so a lot remains unintegrated. And so to me, Chapel Perilous these days refers to that kind of non-local strata, this kind of dimension that is beyond time and space. It's non-local. And it's almost like the cloud, the Apple cloud. It holds data. It holds the unintegrated aspects of your personality until you're ready to pull them down out of the cloud and into your body and live them out.
I love that. That's a great metaphor. It really works for me, seeing it that way, about this unintegrated material being non-local, but somehow within the cloud of our being, perhaps defined using these 8 circuits. And so we begin to integrate that material by working with the 8-circuit model.
Well, we would work with ourselves using the 8 circuits as a kind of diagnostic. The 8 circuit brain model, I think, makes a great diagnostic. I don't think it makes a really good treatment plan.
So when you say diagnostic, then, hey, I need to look at this area of my life, and therefore I should consider X, Y, and Z. But
well, the considering of X, Y, and Z is not part of the 8 circuit model so much. That's the user's reaction to the model.
Gotcha.
Diagnostics, there's a number of different diagnostics. Diagnostics are basically any system that helps you identify and track various patterns of whatever the diagnostic is being applied to. And so here, the diagnostic is being applied to the person as a way to identify and track 8 different frequencies or levels of intelligence, 8 different states of consciousness, if you will. And it can help determine where you're lacking consciousness and where your consciousness is stronger and where it's weak. And so then from there, if you have a response of, well, I'd like to become more conscious in this area, maybe a little less conscious in this area, then you have, that process of your own work. Well, what are you going to do to become more conscious in that area? The 8-circuit brain won't do that for you. The 8-circuit brain is just it's an empty diagnostic tool. I think it's a great tool to track these patterns, but the rest of it's pretty much going to be up to the user.
I understand. A framework for assessing.
Yes, that's a really great way of putting it.
Is there anything more you want to say about the 8-circuit model while we're on this subject? There's a lot we could go into there, but...
Yeah, no, not really. I mean, this has been an interesting conversation, weaving in and out of Chapel Perilous, the ritual work of paratheater, and, coming back around to Chapel Perilous and a bit with the 8 circuits. The only thing, you yourself, you've been working with the 8 circuits for what, almost 15 years in a sense?
Probably almost 25.
Wow. So you're developing your own relationship to it. And I know you're probably going to be coming out with some more writing and maybe a book. I'm really curious what angle you're going to be taking in presenting the circuits, through your own experience and vision.
Right. Well, I've written 2 things already, and I think in a sense I've said what I needed to say. It's more a matter of developing it further, but I think there's a developmental perspective on the lower 4 circuits that ties in with modern developmental psychology that needs to be re-expressed a little more clearly, which goes all the way back to Freud, really. You can map the first 4 circuits right to Freud, but it also, we've evolved those theories beyond Freud. And I think that can be more well developed, as well as tying it in with Jung and development of consciousness. And that leads to all the modern neuroscience that supports a lot of these development theories. And that's all neat, and people seem to really like that. But I think to the extent that you have, you said you're an expert in the 8-circuit model, I would agree with that. But I'd say you've continued to develop it. You've brought embodiment to the model. You've brought this notion. I think Leary hinted at a connection between upper and lower circuits, but he never really developed that idea, and you've really taken it and run with it. But to the extent that you've brought embodiment to the model, I would like to really bring relationship to the model. When we talk about relationships and the 8 circuits, a lot of times folk will try to pigeonhole it to the 2nd circuit or maybe the 4th circuit social. And I think the whole thing, I look at it as from a relational perspective. And so that's, I think, the overall theme I'd like to continue to develop and express.
I think that's wonderful. I have in my own private or personal experience with the circuit, something I don't teach so much because it's too valuable.
Would you say it is sacred in that sense?
Well, sacred to me in that it ties into my artistic and creative processes, which, though I don't apply those processes for me are highly intuitive and instinctive even. And so I don't really bring in intellectual explanations around, this is how I create. This is how, how the creative process works or how art works. I just don't go there. I don't school people on creativity. However, the relational aspect that you mentioned is quite close to me because, for example, in the Circuit 7 experience in my life, I have an open relation to what I call the Muses archetype. The Muses archetype is an autonomous agency that comes and goes. It has its own agendas and its own kind of conditions to appear or disappear, meaning I have to live a certain way of life. I have to adjust my thinking in a particular way in order for the Muses to stay around, almost in a sense of how I do my best so that I can remain appealing to the Muses. I'll put it that way. It's a kind of a courtship. And I know the things that turn the Muses right off because I've gone through episodes where they're just completely disappeared. They're gone. It's like, what happened? What did I do? I fucked up. It's like in any relationship, you fuck up and the lover leaves you. So, I've figured out, okay, what are the things? What are the adjustments and the other kinds of ways of living? And I don't teach that. I don't share that. That's just, from my own self. But it's completely relational. And this is why I relate to what you're saying about it. I think you're on to a good direction. It's a really healthy direction. And I find relational also in all the 8 circuits, different points of relational dynamics. And it's almost as if through each of the 8 circuits, the whole notion of relationship differs. They each have their own definitions or ways of even knowing and experience what relationship is.
Yes, that's what I'm gunning for.
Yeah, good for you. Stick with that. You're onto something. It's a very rich territory.
Yes. And I think it's pretty key for a lot of things we face today. You mentioned the Muses, and it's been a while, but you spoke of the anima as granting access to the Muses at one point. And I noticed in your note in your current book, there's no anima shrine, but there's a muse ritual that's in conjunction with what looked like a holy trinity of personal values.
The anima archetype is something I've been intimately involved with unconsciously at first in my 20s and 30s when I was projecting it onto women in romantic pursuits and so forth. And then later on in my 40s, I mistakenly assumed that the anima was also the muse. It was the same archetype. And I realized fairly soon that they were different archetypes entirely. Even though I've been inspired by my experience with the anima, it's of a very different ilk than the muses archetype. But what I've discovered and this is personal to me, I don't know if it's true for everyone else or any other artist, but in my own interactions with the anima, she seems to be somewhat of a messenger between my conscious ego and the muses sometimes. Not always, but sometimes she will serve as a kind of a go-between. And she knows she's not the muse now, finally. And so she doesn't give me as much flack, because I was just mistreating her before, identifying herself as something other than herself. And now I know who she is.
You understand her better.
Yeah, she's not the muse. And so she's serving a more functional role in my life as a kind of a go-between, kind of a relay between the muses and myself. Because sometimes the muses as an archetype, it's a little bit like white light energy. It's just too bright. It's too pure. And so through the anima is not pure. She's very dirty. She's, full of, mud and sticks and hair and, she's got the sin of the universe in her and she's in love with herself. The white light goes through her and it's more palpable. I can deal with it, as it becomes more humanized, and that way also I avoid burnout because, too much direct contact with certain archetypal energies can result in a certain kind of psychological burnout. I've discovered by experience and have learned.
As far as the muse and this holy trinity of, my interpretation was holy trinity of values, personal values. What's the relationship there?
The only trinity that I've included in the muse ritual structure is the trinity of gut, heart, and head. And the reason being is that between those three centers in the body, the ritual that we go through before the muses ritual, the kind of prep ritual of the head, heart, and gut, what that does is it opens up the body as a totality, so that, we inhabit the head center, we inhabit the heart center, we inhabit the gut center, so that we approach the muse more with our totality, not just with our head, not just with our heart or gut or any combination, but with all three intact. And I have found that in doing so, that the instrument of self, once it's fortified by the activation of the three internal centers, can better absorb the signals of the archetype of the muses and can better absorb them and remain intact, meaning not get blown away by it, not get disrupted and disturbed or thrown off center too much about it. The muses, they're a badass archetype. They don't mess around. They can cause damage.
Gotcha. So there's using the head, heart, gut as a way to, I want to say ground, but I don't know if that's the right word, but help manage the experience.
Yeah, grounding and a sense of building more sustenance and substance of presence, so that you have something to offer, you have something to interact with the muses. You're not just coming in naked saying, "Give me the inspiration." I did that at first in the very early stages. I said, I don't need to prepare. I'll just walk naked into the muses circle. I just got knocked right down to the floor. Just like face plant.
Right. Be careful what you wish for.
Yeah. And I just crawled back to no form at that point,
Well, maybe one last question here on dreaming, or one last topic to explore, perhaps. There's a dreaming ritual in the book, using dreams to access the imagination. What comes up for me when I think of a global Chapel Perilous is Joseph Campbell saying that we need a new myth. I just wonder if the collective could dream a new myth into consciousness. Maybe that's a little too abstract. Well,
when you're locked into the universal we and thinking of how are we as a collective going to be doing this or that, you're going to keep talking about it. Nothing's going to really happen. And I think the action begins at the individual level and then branches out to other individuals and then perhaps clustering into communities and so forth. Otherwise, you're what's the word? Wrestling with generalizations. It doesn't get specific. And it's in the specificity that I think that true change occurs.
I wonder if that's a good point to leave this. Antero, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Certainly, I would say you are an expert in the Eighth Circuit brain. I recommend your books. I've taken your course several times, and I think it's well worthwhile for anyone interested in applying the model.
True.
And with that, thank you for your time.
You're very welcome. It's been my pleasure.
Mine as well. That concludes our episode. Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed it. A big thank you to Antero Alli for taking the time to talk with us. You can find Antero on Facebook and at verticalpool.com. Several other links you'll find in the show notes. Thank you to Christina Pearson and Richard Ross of Hilaritas Press, and thank you to producer Ryan Reeves for putting it all together. Our next episode, releasing on the 23rd of June, will feature Jesse Walker. Until then, I am your host, Mike Gathers, signing off with love and cheerfulness. Amor et hilaritas.